I unfortunately have to tell you that we are at time, and that means that it's time for a talk. So I know that we're in day 3. I know that we're kind of like running down to the end. I know that there's only been one bomb scare so far, so you know, like let's see if we can keep bringing that thing out. And I know that we had some lunch. We've got some other things going on. I don't know how the energy is in this room, so I do want to find out how the energy is in this room. So hi, NDC. That was actually pretty good. That was actually pretty good. Okay, so glad to meet you. I have been touring around to different NDCs, first in Porto, now in London, and so excited to be here. My name's Lemon, and I make websites. I've been making websites for around about 20 years or so. Sometimes I'm, you know, pretty damn good at it. Sometimes, well, there's some websites that I've made that I would not personally cop to. But I've been making websites for a long time. I still love it. The communication medium of the internet is so wonderful and exciting to me. I love the fact that websites mean that you don't have to enter some sort of walled garden where some app store can say, oh, we don't like the way your icons are. You don't have any right to tell me what I can do with my website. If I want to make a bad website, I get to make a bad website. And the only thing that happens is, well, there's two things that happen. Either nobody sees my bad website or a bunch of people see my bad website. But I've been making websites for quite a long time, and I use a bunch of different technologies to do that exact thing. So I personally write a lot of my code in Pug. I don't know if any of y'all have seen Pug, but it is an HTML preprocessor, very, very similar to Haml. Kind of looks a little Python-esque with the indentation-based thing. It's basically just HTML, but faster. And I've enjoyed Pug very much. I also really, really like Sass. I adopted Sass really early on when doing the actual pre-compiling of it was a lot more of a process than it is now. Getting Sass into a project is really, really easy. And again, it's not that you're learning a new language. It's that you're extending out a language that's already beautiful. You're extending out CSS. And I find that very exciting. I do also write a whole lot of Vue. I was looking at different, those different frameworks, the React and the Angular and the Vue. Vue was just the one that made the most sense to me, so it's the one I kept going with. But also, I found some corporate clients that needed me to write some Ember. Well, okay, I'll figure that out. We can write some Ember, no problem. There's also lots of situations where a client's going to just say, well, we have this .NET project, and we need you to write some C#. Okay, awesome. Well, they'll just write some C#. Plenty of times, though, I'll end up writing a website where I have to be writing PHP. Because there's some sort of CMS that's going to exist out there, and that CMS is almost invariably, Umbraco exists, other things exist, but almost invariably a CMS is going to end up being in PHP. I don't do it nearly as often as I used to, but I used to for a while to give myself sort of like little handholds to start with. I use something called Bourbon. Bourbon Sass mix-in that just sort of like gives you some sort of like very early footholds to go with that. It's a little bit deprecated now, but I still do reach for it. I do sometimes reach for bourbon or beer or gin. But all of those, whoa, we just went right to the end. But all of those platforms, except for the two that I just made up right in this moment, boil down to 3 essential facts, 3 unbreakable facts of web development that you need to be cognizant of. And those 3 facts are HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. No matter what you're doing, no matter what sort of like Ruby microservice or Java monolith kind of thing, as long as you're making a website, no matter what it is, you're going to be boiling that down to HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. If you obfuscate it away, that's cool, but those languages will still exist. And of course, we're going to be talking about the CSS port of it, because I think that, no, man, That's not true at all. I would never, ever, ever, ever say out loud, except for facetiously in this example, that CSS is easy. CSS is not easy. In the words of Dave Rupert, one of the co-hosts of Shop Talk Show, he said CSS is pretty easy. The only thing you have to do is remember about 45,000 key value pairs, and then you're good to go. CSS is not easy, no, but CSS is great. It is an interesting, dynamic language that is incredibly powerful, and I think that is what always excites me about it. So you're probably familiar with this GIF, and I know that you've seen this GIF before, and I've seen this GIF plenty times before. People tweeted at me, and I'm not saying I don't get it. I do get it. The entire point of this talk is that I do recognize these frustrations that put this thing to light, because they are real. You can get tripped up with a lot of CSS weirdness, but what I'm going to try to do is change some minds. So I want to start off here, if I may, and I wanted to just do an honest raise of hands. This talk, of course, is called I'm going to make you stop hating CSS. And by a raise of hands, I want to just see how many people genuinely would say that they hate CSS. They hate it. Wow. OK. All right. We got, OK, that's fair. I get it. Again, sir, I totally get it. It is a valid thing to hate CSS. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm just going to try to tell you some things that are more interesting about this and make it more graspable and make you think of it a little bit more like this. Because CSS is just a series of rules that when those rules are applied to the DOM, interesting things happen in succession. So today's agenda, we're going to do a couple things here. Number one is we're going to talk about things that are weird. CSS is a spec that's existed for multiple decades, and it is an additive spec. It is not a spec that ever gets removed from. Every change that's made to CSS is an additive change. So that means that things sometimes are weird. We're going to move into some things that are great, because there are great things about CSS. If there weren't, then this would be a weird-ass talk. And then we're going to close out with some things that you can try now, because if you want to sort of level up your CSS skills or just get a little bit more of a feeling of those things, I've got some recommendations that I've personally used and have recommended to other people. So with that said, let's get weird. This, of course, is the band Focus singing a song called Hocus Pocus. If you're wondering, that's interesting, a song called Hocus Pocus by the band Focus. I wonder what those lyrics look like. Those are those lyrics. Somebody wrote that shit down. Like, that's not, Google didn't do that. Google would have tried to turn this into words. It would have tried to make sense of it. A human being went, yo, day, do, yo, do. People have to know, man. People have to know. I mean, if you're not posting on the internet, then really, what are you doing with your life? One of those things that is weird is the concept of overflow. And the concept of overflow is, I think, best defined by another image that I'm pretty sure you've seen in your life. And that image is this. I know, maybe you've seen this before. Maybe some of you own this mug. I've definitely seen this mug in person. I do not own this mug, even though people have tried to give it to me. And this is totally reproducible in CSS. In fact, not only reproducible, it's reproducible very easily. So I'm just going to reproduce this thing in CSS. So I'm going to say, I want to make a box, and my box is going to have a border of 0.1 EM, solid white. If you're not familiar with the concept of EMs, you can do units that are sort of like, rather than pixels or whatever, you can do something that's relative to the actual M size. By either EM or CH. And so you're saying, I care about the font size in this measurement, so therefore if the font size changes, you should change with it. To the same stick, we're going to say that the width of our box is going to be 4 EM, and our padding, about 0.3 EM. So that all taken care of, and then we just got our HTML, and there we go. We made it. That is that graphic that you've seen before. That is definitely the output of CSS. So that's something that we have to fix now. We have to fix that design. OK, cool. Well, there's a couple ways to do that. First of all, we can say overflow hidden. Very simple concept of just, I've got a box, and my box is this big, and if something's bigger than this box, just kick it out. It goes away. Hide that shit. It's overflow hidden. And we do that. And then we get this, which is, I mean, layout-wise, it's OK, but it's definitely not pulling our message across. Like, we're not actually getting our message across that CSS is awesome. So I wonder if there's another way to do this. So we're going to try instead overflow y hidden. So when we state concepts like overflow that have an x and y axis, by saying that overflow y is hidden, what we're saying is overflow x, therefore, isn't. And so I'm going to say if overflow y is hidden, which in this case it would be, the y-axis, you can go ahead and scroll that or not. It's totally up to you, browser. I'm going to let you do this. I'm just going to change the value of overflow y. And so in doing that, we get this, which, like, I mean, OK, so like that's, well, that, OK. I mean, that kind of got our message across, but I wouldn't say that we've fixed the problem. We really haven't solved the design problem here. So, OK, let's keep going. Word break break word. Word break break word is actually a property that exists in CSS. And when I say to you CSS is weird, this is what I mean. You have to, if you're going for this idea, you have to type into your IDE word break break word. And by the way, everybody involved in the CSS spec that wrote that went, sorry, we really should have called that something else. That was a mistake, but you know, you can go ahead and live with that. If we do word break break word, we're saying, OK, well, you know, usually you're going to just take any word and just like extend that thing out. I want to break that rule now, and you can just go ahead and just smash that word down together, and then we get this. And so like that's, you know, I mean, like that's a kind of more of like a, you know, like a shopping mall, like a upscale, like shopping mall kind of shirt, and that's something. But again, we still haven't fixed it. We still haven't fixed our problem. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. We've got text overflow ellipsis. So I can say that, you know, this is something that actually ends up really, really useful if you end up doing some sort of like sort of smushed together like table or something where there's like way too much content. You can say, OK, well, go ahead and, you know, and let that text go. But if it gets to the end, I want you to just put an ellipsis at the end of that and let it go like that. You can also like change that effect on hover. So for example, you can have like a table header, text overflow ellipsis, and you hover on it, and then it shows you the actual thing. Totally possible. And in this case, we've got CSS is CSS is Let's go back to this rule. So when we started this thing out here, we said we were going to have a border. And that border was going to be white. We said we'd have a padding. That makes sense, because we don't want our actual text to smash into our border. But what we had right here was a defined width of 4EM. We said that the box had to be this big. And then we put objects that were too big inside of the box. This, in fact, never was a CSS problem. It is a design problem. There is no conceivable way to hang out that design and still have it make sense. Your box is too small. So we can just go ahead and remove that property, and then we end up with this, which I definitely still do think that it is. I've got the idea for this from a blog post on CSS tricks. So that I'm going to talk about again in a little bit, because I do always find it really, really useful. Another concept here is the concept of position, which also can be a little bit confusing for sure. So for example, there's a couple of different position properties. And if I like throw a div on the screen, if you're really good at CSS, I'm going to ask you to be quiet for just a moment here. But if I throw just a regular old div on the screen, and I don't give it any property, what is the actual initial value of that div? Any guesses? Glenn, you got a guess? Nope. OK, Glenn doesn't have a guess either. Relative is a great guess, but totally the wrong guess. Thank you so much, you stooge. You walked in here, and I immediately just called you out for having a wrong answer because it was a trick question. The correct answer is that the initial value of a P, of a div, of an ABBR, of sort of like almost any element I can think of is going to have a position of static. A position of static is very close to position of relative, but worse. And we're going to go through why here. So for example, we've got our relative position div, and this is doing exactly what you think, right? We've got a box. I gave it a little bit of margin, and then I'm going to go ahead and scroll that thing down, and we've got a box. We've got a box on a grid. That's very exciting. Now we've got an absolute positioned box. Now this absolute position is going to be positioned to its nearest restrictive element. So for example, if I have an absolute positioned little circle here up in the corner, and then I do an absolute positioned star inside of that circle, that's going to be its nearest restrictive element. So if I do a top, it's going to be 5 pixels to the top of that holding container. If it doesn't have a restrictive element, it's just going to accept the body. So it's going to stick itself to the body. That's where the static thing comes in. We move on, and we've got position fixed. Position fixed is a situation where you're working at your job and everything's going okay, and then some guy in marketing comes over to me and goes, hey, I got a question for you. When people come to the site, how do we do the thing where like the box comes up and it says, please enter your email? The correct answer to that is don't. You go, that's impossible. That's actually never been done before. They must be using some sort of platform, and we probably have to pay for it. Like, that is emphatically evil and emphatically bad. But if you need to do it and you lose that fight, position fixed is the thing. Position fixed will never care about any bounding element. It does not. Position fixed does not care about the DOM. It doesn't care about the body. It doesn't care about any containing element. It only cares about the screen, which means that if I go ahead and just scroll in the screen, position fixed go ahead and stays there. A little bit similar to this, and something that for a long time people were doing with JavaScript, is actually position sticky. Position sticky is very, very cool because it is both a relative and a fixed element. You can give position sticky element a margin of top, bottom, left, right. You can also give it an absolute of top, bottom, left, right, and it will toggle between these things. So in the case of my position sticky right here, I've got it margined from the top. I've got it margined from the left, and it's going to work basically like a relative element, except for when that hits the top, it's just going to stay there. Now again, this is the kind of thing that people have been doing a lot of complicated JavaScript to get to wrap that thing around, and that was necessary for quite a while. But in the last, I would say 4 years now, position sticky exists and can stack on top of itself. You can do position sticky inside of position sticky elements so that they can carry their own relative inheritance, and it works very, very good. And then finally, we've got position static, which is the same thing that we saw in the beginning, right? So if we look at all 5 of these things together, we can see that these things operate slightly differently, except for our static and our relative element stay together with each other. So if we look at those things, this is what these all look like. Our relative is going to follow the page flow and provide a restrictive parent, and our static is going to be the same as above. It's just going to be less helpful. So then you're looking at that and you're going, well, okay, with all of that said, well, what's the difference? We've got, in the case of a relative and a static element, I don't know if you've ever had this problem, but you'll be laying out something and you've got these little boxes, and then you want this box to be on top of this box, and this box is behind this box. And you go, okay, well, z index 9. And it's like, no. And you're like, okay, cool, z index 999. No. Z index 99999, god damn it, what is winning here? When you're doing that, the thing is that your static element is going to ignore this value. So you can play with that z index all you want. It's just not going to do it. Your top, bottom, left, right, also, it won't care. You give it those elements, and the position static does not care about those things. It also will not hold an absolute. It will not, if it's got an absolute container inside of it, it'll let that absolute container bound out. So why does it exist? Well, because we were talking about in the very beginning, CSS is an additive spec. As long as that continues to be the case, it does continue to be the case. So one thing that happened, for example, many, many years ago is a lot of people did these CSS resets, where, for example, you would do like asterisk, border box, And then that means that if a box has a width of 300, I mean the box has a width of 300. I don't give a shit about padding. I don't give a shit about border. I want the box itself to be a width of 300. And you can do that and make things a little bit more sane. So you also could do, for example, this and say, well, OK, we're going to start out things, and before anything goes, I want you to just put everything as position relative. And you can do this. The only issue that you might run into is that if you are working with other people's code, which we all tend to do from time to time, you might run into a situation with that containing element. Because if you're looking at code where there was supposed to be a static element and an absolute element is supposed to be inside of it and bust out, that's going to break. So I would say before trying this, which totally, again, is a valid approach, there's one of those things where it's like, oh, you know, it's technically a performance hit as long as you have like 45 kajillion divs on the screen. OK, cool. But like, if you want to do this, you totally can. But what might be a little bit better is if you're struggling with something, if you're struggling with the margin, if you're struggling with the z-index, just add position relative. And so many times, it's going to fix that problem. I wrote a Codepen article on that if you want to read more and see some actual code examples behind this thing. But I want to move on to a third and hopefully most important thing that is weird, which is float. When I look at float, I don't actually see it like that. That's not what float looks like to me. What float looks to me is like this. Now, float was a property that was made many, many, many years ago, sort of when, you know, the idea of e-magazines were a thing. And it was really made for one thing. The entire concept of float was if we've got a picture and we want to wrap some text around the picture, that's what a float is. So we can do that exact thing, right? So I'm going to lay out a semantic article. I'm going to give this thing an image, and I'm going to say, OK, I want you to get a float left over there. I've got a source, and I'm going to do some paragraphs. And if I do just that simple bit of markup with our float left, then it's fine. That's what we want, right? We've got our picture of Tina. We've got something that a friend of mine created called Tina Ipsum, which is just randomly generated quotes from Tina Belcher of Bob's Burgers. That text floats around that. Everything looks great. This is a viable web page. But we can take that exact same thing, and by only messing with the content, we can make something terrible happen, which is this. So this is the exact same thing, except for instead of our 3 paragraphs, we now just have 1 paragraph. So that's not great. Like, that seems like a strange thing. And the reason why this is happening is that you have a floated element. Then you've got this first paragraph, and the first paragraph says, OK, well, I want to take care of that floated element, and I'm just going to loop around here, and then it's done. And then your containing element goes, well, I'm done too. And it's like, awesome, we were floating right here. Just go ahead and close that thing out. And this will happen so frequently with floats. This is such a endemic problem to floats. There is a fix. There is a fix. And if you're doing anything in somebody else's code base, especially something that is float-based, this code actually exists somewhere in there. So if you don't know, every element can have a pseudo element, or actually 2 different pseudo elements, both a before and an after. So I can say I can make a div, and then I can make an after element, and I can say, OK, so I've got this container, and it might contain a float. And so I'm a little worried about that. So I want you to create a after element. I have to give it some content, but we're not going to give it really any content. We're going to say that it's got a display table, and we're going to clear both the left and the right side. And by doing just that hack, and it is totally a hack, we've actually got this thing fixed, just with that line of code. Which is nice, except for, like, why does this work? And why this works ends up getting sort of philosophical, because we've got now a situation where here is our article, and this is our after element. So our image starts here. We've got our paragraph here. And then our after element, which is something that we just put in to say we want to make a clear fix because there might be a float over here. We're going to say, here's a table that exists in theory. Please don't bother to render it. There's nothing to think about with this table, but this table should have both a clear left and a clear right. And by doing that, we can actually fix this specific layout problem and make essentially a float layout. So to that end, I mean, let's just make a layout with floats. Like, we did it, right? We put 3 lines of code in. We can just fix our layout problems forever. And so all we need to do is we just need to create a web page. Like, Twitter did this. That's what Bootstrap was. Bootstrap was a completely float-based layout. There was so many frameworks that were exactly float-based layouts. We can do that as well. And so what we need to do is we just need to make a web page. And a web page is, of course, pictures of William Riker with quotes from William Riker. So there we go. We've made our web page. We can cause a diplomatic crisis, but he's pretty happy about that. He doesn't know if someone can survive inside a transfer buffer for 75 years. But my favorite of this always was, Worf. It's better than music. It's jazz. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make a layout with pictures of William Riker, quotes from William Riker, and we want to do this with floats. And so now that we've got our clear fix, we're in pretty good shape. I mean, there's some code involved in this. We're going to say that every Riker is going to float to the left. It's going to have a width that is calculated. Now, some people don't know that this exists inside of CSS, but it does, and it's very, very robust. You can tell the browser to do math, and the browser will do it. Like, you can give it a calculation, and the computer will go like, yeah, OK, I think I got that. So even IE will actually calculate things correctly, almost all of the time. So we're going to say that every Riker has a width of 33% of the screen. We're going to subtract 30 pixels from that because we want to give a margin and a left to each Riker so that there's a nice little gap between them. And that looks, I mean, fine. So now we can just go on to, OK. Well, that layout is no good. That layout stinks. And this is one of those reasons why if you've used one of those frameworks like Bootstrap no longer does this. They changed some of that, although actually they keep a lot of that HTML structure anyway. But one of the reasons why, if you're ever looking through that Bootstrap code and you're wondering why there's so many container elements, or if you've ever given yourself the pleasure of doing inspect element on any Facebook page, there's a thing that can actually visualize like how deep in the DOM you are, and like every div is like layered in like 45 deep. Twitter, especially TweetDeck, will layer things like literally 80 deep to actually get to your tweet. It's insane. But one of the reasons why that's happening is that we basically just have to create a bunch of container rules because we're like, well, we want to be very explicit about what this content should look like, which is not what CSS should do. CSS should take arbitrary content, hopefully crummily written arbitrary content, and fix it. So there is hope here, and that hope actually has 2 forms, and one of those forms is Css Grid. Css Grid is such an impressive, powerful tool that was added to the CSS spec. CSS spec 3? No. It was added to the CSS spec a number of years ago, and it is a tool for actually making a grid, and it works incredibly well, incredibly deftly, and very, very succinctly. So we're going to make our Riker layout again, but we're going to start over. So we're just going to say that we've got a container element, and then our container element, we're going to say, here's all my Rikers. And we've got a display of grid. We're going to make some columns. I'll get to those in just a moment. And then I'm going to put a gap in there. So that was step 1. And then step 2 is we're done, actually. We've finished our entire layout. When I was actually doing the example of what I wanted this layout to look like so that other people could see like the thing that we were trying to make, I did that in Grid because this layout is in Grid and is 288 bytes, all told. That's pretty amazing. So there's a bunch of ways that you can express your grid, and we're going to talk about the columns. So our columns that are expressed in grid can be done one of a couple ways. And we've got like a multiple of different writing FRs. An FR is a fraction. We're going to get to that in just a moment. We can write the same thing, but just in a little bit of a shorthand. We can kind of mix different units of measurement and create a grid that way. We can repeat an element and say, go ahead and create columns as deep as you like with this particular width. And we can also even give min-max values to that. So I'm going to go through each of those, and this is going to be talking about a very important piece of content that came in the grid spec, and that is the idea of a fraction. So a fraction says that there's a number of space that you've got. You can do rows, you can do columns, you can do whatever. And you say, hey, browser, you've got, I don't know, maybe 860 pixels. I'm not going to get real specific about it. I just want one fraction of that. I want 2 fractions of that. I want 3 fractions of that. And so you can just take and mix and match these things, and that fraction is really just meaning whatever's left. So to explain that, I actually would like to bring you the recipe of my gin and tonic. Now, I'm not a fancy person by any stretch of the imagination. I just like to drink, and I do like to drink gin. And so when I make a gin and tonic, basically I'll use 4 ice cubes because I like it nice and cold. I'll do a jig or a gin. I'll do a lime wheel, and then I'm just going to use tonic water, like however much I've got. Like, is this one of these little glasses? Is this one of these big glasses? I'm not really sure. I'm just going to use an amount of tonic water. And in order to do that, when I've got these different measurements, I can still make that same gin and tonic no matter what kind of glass I have. So, so let's look at some examples of our grid here. So we're going to start off with a grid template columns of 1FR, 1FR. We're just saying, I want you to make a grid. I want each of those columns to just be one fraction of whatever you've got. And we've got this. I mean, yay, but like, let's not really throw a party for that specific layout. It's fine, it's fine, it's fine. But now let's say that we're going to take this thing and basically shorthand it. So we can just go like repeat for 1FR, and now we can make this thing. So this is something where, for example, if you're looking for any sort of like CSS framework which specifically is giving you a grid structure, like this is the thing that you can use to supersede all of that. If I want the idea of a 4-column layout, I can just go columns equals 4, repeat 4, columns equals 5, repeat 5, columns equals 6, repeat 6. Like I can just make that thing shorthanded without any other framework involved. But now we've got the idea of actually mixing our columns. So if we've got, we're going to start off with a 200 pixel column, then 2 additional fractions. And then by doing that and just giving it these HTML elements, that's going to give it this. So now we've got the idea of something where we could say, we've got maybe a sidebar, we've got a header, we've got like different kind of content sections, and we want to specify like where these things are going. Neat. But now let's take this. So in this case, I'm going to say that I got a grid template columns, and I want that to repeat 240 pixels. So I'm going to say, hey, browser, I don't really know how big you are at this point, and I'm not really that keen to ask. What I want to tell you is that I want you to take this space and fill it up with a bunch of 240 pixel columns, as many as you like, and then wrap that thing around. And if I tell that to the browser will go like, OK, well, there you go. You wanted 240 pixels. There's 240 pixels, and we're just going to do this. Now, I could be doing this and resize this thing, and I don't have to write breakpoints to be doing that, because it's just going to know, this guy wants 240 pixels, just keep slamming those things out. Which is all right, except for you're looking at the end of that thing, and you're going, well, that's not bad, except for the thing that you've got this weird old gap here, so maybe you could do something about that. Yeah, we can do something about that. We're going to rewrite that spec in just one line of code and say, OK, I want you to instead repeat autofill min-max 250 pixels to 1FR. So in that case, what we're saying is, hey, browser, I want you to fill this whole thing up. I got a box, and I need you to just start making columns. And what I know is that I do not want this to be less than 250 pixels. But if it has to be bigger, you know, go ahead and just take that fraction of whatever. And so by doing that, we'll get this layout. Now, there's an important thing about this layout is that if you wrote this in a bunch of different ways, it would require some real breakpoints to take care of this, because you would say, well, okay, so if it's on, if it's on this width, we're going to have 6 columns across. If it's on this width, we're going to have 5 columns across. But just by doing that line and letting the browser figure out how big each of those boxes could be, we can just make a fully responsive layout literally with that one line of code. That's a responsive layout right there by itself. But we can get even fancier than that. Yes, yes, indeed, we can. And one of those ways that we can do that is by starting to rewrite some of these rules as far as specific child elements. So we're starting off with a grid that we saw before, which is just a simple 4-column grid, repeated. But then we're going to say, I'm sort of in a rum mood right now, so I want to see some rum drinks. So we're going to highlight that mojito, that daiquiri, that pina colada, and then we're going to say to those ones, I actually want you to span 2 columns, and I want you to span 2 rows. And in so doing, we can take our regular layout, that is single stacked layout, and we can give it that and end up with this. Now, these things do not have different containers. Each and every one of these is a sibling of itself. But we've said to specific classes, you're allowed to span 2 containers, or you're allowed to span 2 columns, you're allowed to span 2 rows. You can also say to that thing, well, I actually want you to take and eat up the 3rd column. So if there's a 3rd column in there, just go ahead and take that. And we can just specify that in all the children. We can get even slightly fancier, though, because I'm going to give you just this piece of HTML. Now, you can kind of imagine what this sort of looks like. But we've got a bunch of different drinks. And in each of those drinks, we've got our pina colada, our screwdriver, a mojito, or whatever. And then we've also specified what those glasses are. And so there's a bunch of different glasses that are used by, bartenders, not myself. But, there's a bunch of different glasses that can be used for different drinks. And now I want to just rearrange these glasses. And if I wanted to rearrange these glasses, I'd have to write a bunch of different queries. I'd have to write a bunch of different, like PHP for this or something. Or I could just actually start to use order. So we've got this here. This is what our glassware looks like. But now I'm going to say, OK, well, everything that's in a Collins glass, that goes first. Everything that's in a martini glass, that goes second. Everything that's in a tulip glass, that's going to go third. Everything that's in a margarita glass, that goes fourth. By taking that exact same markup and changing only those values, we can actually go ahead and just rearrange everything by the actual glass that it's put into. When you're doing this for like magazine layouts or something like that, and you've got a situation where the ad is supposed to go over here, except for if it goes down into a phone, it goes over here, and you have to write a whole bunch of wackadoo queries for that, you can do that by just having a container and then just setting that order on different breakpoints, changing that order around however you feel like it. Or even you've got a situation where somebody else wrote the HTML and you can't touch the HTML. So now you've got something that's floated on the left side, but actually I need it to be down here. You give that thing a grid, and then you just say, well, now I want to change the order of these things. And you can just change the order of things right there in the CSS by itself. Okay. All right, well, in any front-end talk, this kind of thing is going to come up. And the thing is that this actually isn't as bad as you might think that it is. Now, of course, the usual caveat of at this point, if you're using Win 10, Win 11, Win 11 doesn't even have it in there. And then Win 10 is don't use this, please. Actually don't use this browser. It was Edge, which is fine. Edge is totally fine. But this story is actually pretty good. So if we look at the actual grid support, we've got an incredible adoption, like all the way across. And even getting into the 10 and 11, all we need for that specific thing is we need prefixes. And if we actually look at the market share base of all of those things, then we see, first of all, we see a lot of green. And secondly, so much Chrome. Like looking at the amount of Chrome, like, you know, I'm always into, there's so many great people like that are on the Chrome team, and there's so much great innovation that Google made with Chrome. But whenever any browser has this much of a market share, it's a little concerning. Also, just over into the Safari on iOS. Has anyone in this room ever used, like, for example, like Firefox on Safari? No, you haven't. This is a fun thing that's actually in the Apple terms of service, is you can go ahead and go to the App Store, and you can download something that's called Brave, and you can download something that's called Chrome, and you can download something that's called Firefox, or Vivaldi, or Opera, or whatever you like. You can do all of those things, but that actual Safari renderer is baked in legally. They will not let any other browser happen. And so I've had situations of trying to debug something and like, I thought this was only a Safari issue. It is, but Safari is actually just wearing other clothes a lot of the time. Kind of like Bugs Bunny, actually. So the takeaways here is that IE 10 and 11 has it has some support. You can definitely do grid stuff in IE 10 and 11, but you're going to probably want to do some vendor prefixing, some testing to that because they had an earlier version of the spec. If you're in IE 9, yeah, then that's a problem. But the other thing that's also in there is the concept of Flex. Now, Flex has a little bit better support because it is a slightly older spec, but Flex is one of those things that actually sort of got missed because CSS Grid came on the stage and did so many impressive things so fast that it got a whole bunch of hoopla, and people went, oh, there was this grid thing, but we don't really care about that. But Flex is actually still very cool. So even though I've talked about CSS Grid, and even though I would definitely encourage everybody to try to just bang out a little grid in CSS Grid, I do actually want to bring to your attention Flex as well. So if we do our Riker layout, and we just want to do that same thing in Flex, then really all we have to do is we're going to define, with a little bit more code, but we're going to just define the concept of our Rikers, and we're going to say, OK, so I've got these Rikers, and I want those Rikers to wrap, because by default, the concept of Flex doesn't want to wrap unless you tell it that it should wrap. And then the justify content is going to be space between. So you can say, you know, you're going to have this container element, there's going to be stuff in there, and there might be space in the middle. And you can say to Flex, well, you know, you can do different things with that. You can go ahead and you can center everything. You can do space between. You can do space around. So there's a gap in the middle, but there's also a gap around it. You can stretch stuff inside of it. And then for each Riker, we're going to go back to our calc of our width. But you'll notice that I didn't actually use the property of width here. I used the property of flex basis. And the reason why was that Flex invented this concept of, you know, ish. And so if you're doing a Flex container and you're doing Flex elements inside of it, you can actually say, well, OK, so I've got this thing, and I want it to basically have a basis of, you know, 300 pixels or whatever. But I have opinions about whether this thing gets to grow or shrink. Now, you're looking at a 0 and a 1 here, but in this case, this does not need to be a binary value. You can actually say flex shrink 5, which means if I've got a bunch of things and something needs to shrink, that one of the higher value of the flex shrink gets to shrink first. But we can say I have a basis, and that's basically what I want you to do. But if things start to get hairy, because, you know, a lot of times we still think about this concept of like there's desktop, and then there's mobile, and that's fine, but like there's so much shit in the middle, you know, that dealing with just those concepts of just desktop and mobile means that there's going to be so much squishy area in the middle, which is real to everyone's experience, because they're going to have, honestly, different devices, but also just different layouts. And if you're just doing a hard transition from like, well, here's a whole bunch of boxes, and all of these boxes are all like spread out, but then you get to mobile, and it's just bam, it's just a whole bunch of blocks down the line. Like, I get that basis, and I definitely get that like that's how that design seems to come around. But you can actually do stuff where you can say, okay, well, I want you to take this design, and I want you to do it just until the point that it seems that it might break. And then when it gets to the point that it might break, we're going to do some flexibility there in the middle. Flex can be used with or instead of CSS Grid. I would say if you're going to do a layout and you want to do sort of a grid-based layout, you should use Grid. If you want to do something that seems like it needs to be flexible, you should use Flex. And you should possibly use those together, because a grid can go, or a Flex can go in columns or in rows. You can use these things next to each other, work as perfect siblings. We've got, wait, what? That was, oh, yeah. I want to give you another option here of a layout with our Flex, and that is just pictures of Bjork. And so if I say, okay, I'm going to have this Flex container. I'm going to have a Flex. I want that thing to wrap around, and I'm going to do some space between. Then in that case, we've got this gallery of Bjork, which crucially contains a whole bunch of unequal content. And so we can actually say, well, OK, I want you to respect the actual dimensions of whatever those might be. But for that space in the middle, you know, you're a browser. Go ahead and figure it out. Something you couldn't do really in any other layout. You could not do that in any other layout without a whole bunch of very specific kind of container elements. Vertical centering with Flex, I hope that you've never, or I hope that you never have had a situation where somebody has said, well, I can't really center that, because yes, you can. You can always center that. Front-end developers have been able to do vertical centering for literally 10 years. In the case of Flex, display Flex, align item center, justify content center, yes, of course, you can always, always, always vertically center things. This is a concept that I run into every once in a while, and it makes me genuinely like a little annoyed, because we're all trying to be better developers. We're all like at something like NDC to try to learn and to try to level up our own experiences. And then somebody comes around with some sort of clickbait bullshit like, here's 9 CSS and JS libraries you should learn this year. No, man, play with your kids. like watch a movie. I'm going to learn 9 different CSS and JS libraries this year because that's necessary for my career? Absolutely not. If you are somebody that's doing CSS and JavaScript and that's working for you and you're enjoying that experience, cool. That is not my choice, but if that's the way that you want to run things, that's OK. But to everyone else, I would say there's a thing called the Cascade that ends up being really, really important here. So the Cascade has been explained in a whole bunch of ways, but it is, of course, that first C in CSS. And the Cascade I would describe as thus. So the Cascade is individual rules calculated in order of increasing specificity with IDs getting extreme priority, only beat by inline styles, and important being the nuclear option. So that means that I've got rules. All of CSS is just a series of rules, and sometimes those rules override each other, but regardless, we're just going to have rules stack on top of each other. Those are going to be calculated in order, which means that if we've got one rule and another rule comes later and those rules disagree, the one that happened later, all things being equal, that's going to win. But specificity also matters. So for example, if I say that a paragraph should be black, but then I say that a paragraph inside of an article, like article space P, should be red, then that's going to win, because that was more specific. But even more specific than that is the concept of an ID, because you can write CSS based on classes, or sometimes you can do it on attributes if you feel like it. But if you do it on IDs, which is totally valid, it will totally blow things up. If one CSS class has a score of 1, an ID has a score of 100. So if something is getting a style and you're trying to figure out how to beat that style out, if it's an ID, it's going to probably start to win. You can beat it, of course, by inline styles, which is what the CSS and JS approach is. It's also technically what, well, no, never mind. There was a talk in here about Tailwind, and I do like Tailwind, and so I shouldn't throw shade, but it is inline styles. And finally, important is the nuclear option. If you're into a situation where you have to do it, you're coming up on a deadline, and things are going bad, and you just need to get this goddamn button done, then you just can use important. Now, everyone would frown on that. But what I would say to you is that if you're in that situation, I want you to make a file that's actually called shame. In my CSS architecture, I have, there's abstracts, there's base, there's layouts, there's sections, there's components, and then I have a file called shame. And things happen. So I end up writing files that go into shame. But when we go to production, I'll say, OK, just so you know, I have 9 rules in here, and we should probably take care of them. So I'm going to actually skip past that because I am starting to run over because our next talk is happening real soon. But if we've got this specific thing with these rules are going to conflict, and we're going to end up with this. Now, one of the things that's really, really helpful is when I'm working on CSS, especially other people's CSS, junior developers that I'm working with, what I like to do is just always have that inspector open. Because if you've got that inspector open, you can just look at any specific piece of content, and you can look at that right there and say, oh, well, OK, so that green is crossed out, and the orange is winning. And you can kind of like grok that cascade just based on the actual inspector right there. A couple of things I want to leave you with. Number one is a really effective game for CSS selectors called CSS Diner. This is a game by Flukeout. And essentially what you have is you're just trying to make a selection. So for example, I want to select the apple on the plate. And so I can see that there's an element called plate, and there's an element called apple. I'm going to go plate, apple. And there we go. I'm going to select the pickle on the fancy plate. So now I've got a plate, and that's got an ID of fancy. And that's got a pickle on it. And I'm going to do that. This is, I think, a really helpful way to kind of like recognize that specificity. There's only, I think it mentions up there, yeah, there's 32 levels, and it is actually a really useful tool just to really hone in your selectors and figure out what those selectors should look like. Another one I want to give you is, it's called Flexbox Froggy. And so this is a game where it's by Thomas Park, and we're just trying to put the frogs actually on the lily pads. So we've got our layout here, and we want to go justify content, space, around, oops, space, between. Oh, no, center. So we've got a situation where we can just kind of like play with these properties. Usually there's going to be kind of tooltips at the top going like, here's kind of where I'm trying to lead you down. And we're just going to use these skills to try to like just get all of our frogs on the lily pads. Really, really cool for helping out and learning some more about Flexbox. Similarly, another one called Grid Garden. By the exact same guy, very similar concept. You're going to have a bunch of different vegetables, and you control the water. So you're just trying to make a grid layout of water that's going to touch all of the vegetables and only all of the vegetables. Codepen is a site that's been going around for a long time. It is not specifically a CSS site. It's kind of an everything site. There is, after Code Sandbox came around, Codepen kind of like extended out their thing. So they do like view applets and stuff like that. But it was started by Chris Coyer of CSS Tricks. So it is a very CSS-friendly thing. But you can, for example, just look at, and I've got, so I just have a search here on CSS only, which is just something that I look at. And, a lot of front-end developers compete of just figuring out how to do really, really insane stuff without CSS or without any JavaScript whatsoever. Sometimes there's a thing with checkbox hacks or whatever, but it does create a whole bunch of very, very cool approaches. I think I saw one over here. I mean, it's neat. There's a lot of really neat things that you can do with only CSS and without having to get really complicated with your stack. Finally is a game that I'm personally obsessed with. It's fantastic. It's called CSS Battle. And CSS Battle is you have to draw exactly the picture that's on the screen. So for example, some of the live battles right here, we have to make this skull. But you have to do this with code golf, which means that you have to solve the drawing, getting a 100% match on the drawing itself, but using as few keystrokes as possible. So it's not only a lesson in CSS, it's also a lesson in how amazingly fault-tolerant both HTML or CSS is. Like, the amount of broken-ass shit that you can write and the browser will go like, oh, I'll try to figure it out, is incredible. CSS Battle is such a cool look into just how bad you can write your HTML and still have it render. So we started off like this, and I saw some hands, and I'm hoping that by the end of it, that we've thought about this language, and we've thought about the powers of this language, and we've thought about a language that is useful and cool and impressive and beautiful. Because I think that CSS is an incredibly beautiful language that I would encourage all of us to just be spending a little bit more time in. So that's the end of my talk. My name is Lemon, and thank you so very much. One last thing I wanted to mention is I know that as developers, we do love stickers, and God knows that I do love stickers. So if you'd like yourself a lemon sticker, I'm just going to spread these all out here. You go ahead and take as many as you like. I am available for any conversation you want to have, CSS, breakdancing, or otherwise. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of the conference.